Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sarah. I'm just blown away that there's 50 people that want to come and listen to data and insight around physical activity on a Tuesday morning. But hey, there we go. I have got a lot of it for you. Just to kind of give you the bad news now. There's quite a lot of information in here. We will, of course, share the slides afterwards. You won't quite, when we share the slides afterwards, you won't quite get the same slides as what I'm showing you now, because I'm showing you a couple of things I shouldn't really show you, but I will explain them when we get to them. And it's just that we've got a kind of an agreement with Sport England around some of the things that we actually publish in terms of sample sizes and so on and so forth. It gets rather boring and technical, but we'll deal with all that. But I wanted to put them in there because they just help us a little bit. And so what I'm going to do today is just take us through this active lives data, demographic data, to just help us understand which parts of our community tend to be more active and which parts of our community tend to be less active or inactive. And I'll come to the definitions of those terms in a second. And I'm going to just explore that in terms of different parts of the population in the East Riding and also different places to the extent that I can. With the information that we've got. Where is all this information coming from? Well, if you don't know, Sport England and Public Health England and the Department of Transport jointly fund a survey, national survey across the whole of the country. It's at least 500 adults in every local authority across the country on a rolling basis over a year, and it's called the Active Life Survey. And they publish this data and we play around with it and try and bring it to life a little bit, which is what I'm going to try and do over the next 55 minutes. And as you can imagine, it's across the country, it's around 175 or 180,000 people. In the East Riding, it used to be 500. It's become closer to 1,000 over the last couple of years, so the sample's got a little bit bigger, and we can then play around with that information and try and present what it's telling us. Just picking up on a couple of terms that you're going to hear me use consistently throughout the presentation. The first one, the first is what's these terms active and inactive and fairly active. Well, what this survey does is it measures the chief medical officer's recommendation that adults should do 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity on a weekly basis, and it should be in bouts of 10 minutes or more. The bit that's important that I want you to just remember in that really technical definition is the moderate intensity. What does that mean? It means you get out of breath a little bit, your heart rate goes up. And it's important, and I'll explain why it's important when I come to a slide a little bit later on. But it's in there because it's all about improving our cardiovascular health. Okay, so if we're doing over 150 minutes, we're active. Okay, if we're doing less than 30 minutes a week, we're inactive. But again, there's a little technical different definition in there when it comes to moderate intensity, and I'll come back to that later. If you're between 30 minutes and 149, you're fairly active, and I've pointed that out for a reason as well, because I usually completely ignore it, but I'm pointing it out for a reason today in the East Riding, which will become clear as I go through. There is one slide towards the end where I'm looking at minutes, i.e. where do we get our minutes from? Do we get them from gardening? Do we get them from walking? Do we get them from playing sport, etc., etc.? And what that is we just basically add up all the minutes that are captured in this through the survey for the East Riding, and we can then group them in different ways. And I'll talk that slide through with you when I get to it. But before we get into the really, and by the way, you'll get the sense of my enthusiasm for this data. I spend all my time locked in a cupboard looking at it. It's a wonderful way to spend my life. Apparently, not everybody looks at it like that. I find that hard to believe, but David and Sarah keep telling me that that's the case. So if there is anything where I get a bit geeky or a bit technical, tell Sarah to tell me to pipe down and move on, because I can get carried away with it at times. I'm going to start by population, and you'll you'll probably know a lot of this information better than I do, especially if you're living and working in the East Riding. You'll be aware of some of this stuff already, but it's really important for thinking about what I'm going to tell you in terms of the physical activity data. So I'm just going to make a few observations about the East Riding population. Okay, the first couple of observations is you'll see through the slide deck that we're comparing East Riding to England. And to be fair, that is a reasonable comparator, because in the main kind of areas of the population where we do analysis of the activity data, your population looks quite similar to England when you start to look at the socioeconomic breakdown, the proportions of people in higher socioeconomic groups, those people that are likely to be better qualified in higher paid jobs, likely to be in more senior roles, higher socioeconomic groups. That proportion looks very similar to what the proportion is in England. When you look at lower socioeconomic groups, those in routine, semi-routine work, more likely to have lower level qualifications, more likely to be lower paid. Again, the proportion is similar to what you see in England. And I'm mentioning those because we know that socioeconomic socioeconomic status, age, whether you've got a disability or not, all impact upon whether you experience being active, or more likely to experience being active, or whether you're more likely to experience being inactive. So the makeup of our community is really, really important to understand this data. And what you observe in the East Riding in terms of those differences to national is there's a greater percentage of older people, particularly over the age of 55, but also over the age of 75. Those proportions in the local population are quite a bit higher than the national population. And because of that, the area's also got very closely associated with that. The area's also got a higher proportion of people with a limited illness or disability. Now, all of those factors would likely to mean that when we compare to England, we might be a little bit behind, because we've got higher proportions of people that are more likely to be inactive. As we get older, we're more likely to become inactive. And you'll see that in the data. But there's a couple of slides in here where we're comparing East Riding to its nearest neighbours. What does that mean? We're comparing you to local authority areas that are demographically very similar. Okay, so it'll be interesting for us to look at those slides and look at what's going on there. But just keep in mind that we've got in the East Riding, the population tends to be older than England, and there's a greater proportion of our population with limited illness or disability. It's also changing quite dramatically, which is what this next slide's we need to get this into our head a little bit, that over the next 20 years, the East Riding population is due to grow about 10-11 percentage points, which is slightly less than England. It's about 14% that growth nationally. But our over 65s is growing by 35%. Okay, that's really quite significant. Now, that is a national pattern. It's about 37 or 38 off the top of my head nationally. So it's in line roughly with what's happening nationally. But we've got to get that in mind, because when we start to think of, you can see on this chart, the baby boomer generation, those of us in our 50s, where those bars are quite long now, and you can see the orange line of where those bars are going to shift to in 20 years time. So that as the baby boomer generation goes through, we're getting a higher proportion of our population in those older age groups. Keep that in mind when we look at some of the physical activity data, because it poses some questions for us to think about in terms of what we need to do, I guess. The other bit that I just wanted to kind of note, because I'm fascinated by it, and you'll probably be much more conscious of why we have this and how this is observed, is part of that population growth is coming from internal migration. What on earth does that mean? It basically older people moving to the East Riding to live in later life from other parts of England. And so you're in the East Riding, you have around 1,000 over 55s that move in to the area on an annual basis, which is quite significant. That's quite And at the same rate, it's probably about 1,400, I think, roughly on average across, over the years, which is quite high. At the same time, you're losing a similar number, slightly less, of our younger population. Why am I mentioning this? Because we're losing our active population and gaining a part of the population that's more likely to be inactive and more likely to come with long-term conditions, which also unfortunately means we're more likely to experience being inactive. So this dynamic is quite important, that we have this in our mind when we're thinking about the way that our population is projected to change over the next 20 years or so. Right, so just keep that in mind. Already got a larger proportion of older people, people over the age of 55, and it's growing quite rapidly, and it's going to continue to do so for the next 20 years. Okay, keep that in mind when we look at some of the data. I'm going to start off at a whole population level. I've got one slide next, which is as hot off the press as it can be when it comes to active lives data that's published every 6 months. They've published some May to May data. They've only, when I say they, Sport England, they've only published the headlines, so I can only give you the headlines. A lot of our analysis has been done on on the last data release, which I'll explain when I get to that slide. So this is the next slide this slide is basically takes us up to May 2021 from May 20. So this whole year is in the pandemic. And the first bit of good news, if we want to call it that, and you'll see it when I go on to the next slide as well, is that the East Riding seems to be relatively stable when it comes to its proportion of inactive people during the pandemic. It's gone up a little bit when the pandemic first hit, and I'll show that in a minute. But then it stayed quite similar, because the data from the previous release is only, I'm looking at the East Riding 28.1, it's only 28.2 on the previous release. So it's relatively stable during the pandemic, which is a bit of a positive. It hides some things, which I'll come back to later, but it's a bit of a positive. The negative is that we're losing active people, but those active people don't seem to be falling in great numbers into inactive. They're falling into that orange band in the middle, that 14.5%. And I'll come back to that again on the next slide, because it's quite important. So sadly, we haven't got the raw data set for this yet for us to do all the analysis on this release. So we've had to do the analysis on the previous November to November data release, because that's the data set that we've got. So this is November 19 to November 20. So it includes the first 8 months or whatever it might be of the pandemic, but it obviously doesn't include all of it, but it does include the onset of it. And what you've got here is you've got a very similar proportion of inactive people as we've got in the latest release. We've got a slightly higher proportion, I think it's about 0.5% higher than the latest release. So we've got this seeping, for want of a better description, of active people, that 58%. That 28.2% of inactive people equates to about 80,000 people inactive across the whole of the area, which is quite a lot of people. But they're not all sedentary, and I will come back to that later. What I wanted to just pick up, actually, now we'll pick it up here, actually. That 13.9% of fairly active has grown quite significantly from the baseline year of 2015. It's grown about 6.5 percentage points. And when you look at the data, and you'll see it when I picked a slide out later, which shows it quite well. It shows the loss of active people, and they seem to be falling into fairly active rather than completely falling into being inactive. So we've got this group of people that I'd argue that we probably need to pay a bit more attention to locally than maybe we would do in other areas, because it's growing, and it's growing from people that are arguably losing the habit to some degree, because we've got this drift from active into fairly active, but inactive, it seems relatively stable, especially given the pandemic. This is the trend for inactivity over over the first 4 years, you lifted up, that dropped down in that 18-19, and the 19-20, so the first part of the pandemic, it's shifted. It's a negligible shift. It's gone up 1 percentage point, which is about a third, or roughly a third of what the national lift was. So it's wavered up a little bit. We know in that May to May data it stayed pretty similar, so that's quite encouraging. But if you were to draw a line all the way through this, it's pretty much flat as a pancake in terms of inactivity levels. I can't say the same for active levels, as I've kind of already touched on. There was a pattern that was heading down from the first 3 years, then it went up, but then we've had a quite significant drop because of during the pandemic year, and the latest May to May suggests that there is a continued drop of those that are achieving 150 minutes. So we need to keep our eye on this, but we also need to have a bit of confidence that we're not completely falling into increasing inactive rates, because it is to some degree bucking the national trend. Nationally, both inactive has gone up and active has gone down significantly. Okay, so at the moment we're seeing a little bit where we're contrasting to that national trend, which is a good thing, and you'll have some knowledge about why. Hopefully, I think about why you think that is. I mentioned earlier that comparing to England is actually not that bad of a comparator for the East Riding, but we can compare the East Riding to its more statistically relevant nearest neighbours. So I'm going to show you that table next. Okay, imagine all of those grey lines that you can see. Each one of those grey lines is a local authority area. Okay, the red line is where the East Riding is at in terms of its proportion of inactive people when it's put into that list of all local authorities. The black lines are your statistically relevant nearest neighbours for the East Riding. Okay, now what you observe on this, what I was really intrigued by, was how until the latest year of data for November to November, the first part of the pandemic, the East Riding was the bottom of the list of those nearest neighbours. So it showed, and what was interesting, 10-12 percentage points behind the top nearest neighbour. So quite some gap when it came to the proportion of inactive people. The pandemic, though, and the area's robustness in terms of not being as affected by the pandemic as maybe other areas, has shifted it up the list a little bit, shifted the area up the list a little bit, and we're for want of a better description, in the best position that we've had in terms of this kind of analysis. The bit that I would take from this is not so much the placings and all of that. That's to a degree irrelevant. What's important for me is the gap with an area that statistically looks like us. It's down to about 5 or 6 percentage points in the latest data that we've got on this slide, but it's been as wide as 12 percentage points. That's quite a big gap. And so what it would suggest to us is that there's potential for room for improvement. But we need to unpick which groups that might be, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on, if that's okay. Okay, I've mentioned this a couple of times already, that it's really easy to think that inactive people are all sedentary, but they're not, because of that term, wonderful term, moderate intensity, getting our heart rate up, getting our cardiovascular benefit from being physically active. And what we see here is 3 kind of groupings when we break that proportion of inactive people down. You've got the nothing group, you've got the sedentary group. It's the biggest part of that cohort of our inactive group that are doing nothing, very sedentary, around 43,000 people across the East Riding. But then you've got this light only group. They are the people that are missing the intensity. That's the reason why they're described as light only, is because when they answer the survey and fill it in online, they get asked questions about whether the exercise, the activities, the movement that they do gets their heart rate up. And if they say no, those minutes that they've logged count as light only minutes. And that group of people is put into the inactive group because they're not getting the cardiovascular benefit that is part of the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation. And what you note here is just how much bigger that group is, and that difference, that 12.3 locally compared to 8.8 nationally, that difference is consistent across the years. So we've got this bigger group of people that are doing something, but it not getting the full, this very likely to be outside, very likely to be getting the mental well-being benefits of any kind of movement, getting the physical benefits of moving, but they're missing, this part of our population is missing the intensity to be getting the cardiovascular benefits. But if you now put that group 12 percentage points with the 14, 15 percentage points of people that are doing, we've got a big chunk of our population that's doing something, but not quite enough in one way or another, either whether it's enough minutes of moderate intensity or whether it's dog walkers walking their dog, because a lot of people that would fall into this light intensity will be walking and not walking quick enough. I have been known in other parts of the country to suggest that we all buy cattle prods. We go around and we try and give people that are not walking down the street quick enough a little nudge, but apparently it's not the appropriate thing to do. But we do need to think about this group a little bit differently, because people that are inactive are likely to be very conscious and aware that they are inactive. People that are walking their dog for an hour a day or doing some low intensity classes may hold perceptions of themselves being, actually, I'm really active, but we're not quite there. We're not quite meeting that definition. And it's certainly a space that needs to be discussed in terms of tactics and what do we do about this? And then add on to it that group that are not quite getting over the minutes, getting enough minutes, that the fairly actives that we touched on earlier. So there's something quite intriguing here for us all to be thinking about what it means to our practice and our work. Let me just skip on. Okay, I've got a couple of slides now about that's the whole population. We're up looking at everybody within it, but we know there's differences. I touched on this earlier when I was explaining why we've done the analysis of the local population. Different groups experience being active in very different ways. And we can unpick some of that to some degree. Sadly, the sample starts to fall apart when we break it down, but we can get around that in some cases, but not all. I'm only going to touch on a few slides here because I will be coming back to it in later sections of the presentation. I just thought we'd start with a little bit in terms of nationally, what's the pattern occurring nationally in terms of this first period of time that we've got data for, that we've collected data for through active lives in terms of the impact of the pandemic. What is being observed nationally is that it has tend to widen inequalities, and in places where it hasn't widened inequalities, like men and women, where the inequalities stayed very similar. Men have probably dropped quicker than in terms of activity levels has dropped quicker than women's, but men have also come back quicker, or the evidence that we've got is that they also get back to activity quicker. We'll come back to gender in a minute because there's an interesting pattern in the East Riding that we need to just have a look at. In terms of those with a limiting illness and disability, the pandemic has had a big impact nationally. We'll come back to that when it comes to the East Riding. And inequalities are generally widened nationally between those with a limiting illness and those without. They've also generally widened between higher socioeconomic status and those in lower socioeconomic status. Of course they're going to have done. We know that older people and those with a limiting illness and disability are more likely to have been under instructions to isolate and to not come out of their home, and that's going to have affected activity levels. We know that furloughing and the period of coming in and out of lockdown has impacted very differently on different parts of our community, especially when it comes to socioeconomic status, with those in higher socioeconomic status much more able to work from home compared to lower socioeconomic status groups who are more likely to be in jobs that are key workers and likely to have been going into work still. And so these things are all complicated and complex and playing out in this data. Okay, what's happening in the East Riding is even more intriguing. So let's have a quick look at that. So we've got, you'll notice we've put some confidence intervals. That's the big grey line, and you'll see that some of them are big. Okay, so we've got to just be cautious with some of this data. We have aggregated some of this data, and I'll come to that in a minute, just to kind of give you a bit more confidence in a couple of the values. But what you've got here is levels of inactivity by different demographic groups, with the highest levels of inactivity on the left-hand side going to the lower levels of inactivity on the right-hand side. Okay, the red tower is the latest year of November to November data, and the grey tower is the previous year's data. So you can see the difference in the East Riding between the latest year and the previous year. You've then got the dot, which gives you the latest year's value for England, and it helps us just think about that comparator. There's a couple of things that I'll just observe on this to begin with that surprise me. Look at the decrease in inactivity levels in that limiting illness group, but the sample size is quite small and that confidence interval is quite wide. So we've just got to be cautious with it a little bit. You've also got this really big increase in inactivity among lower socioeconomic groups, NSX 6 to 8. Okay, again, the sample is small. However, we have aggregated all 5 years of data together for that group, and inactivity for that group, when we aggregate all 5 years of data together, is up at around 38 percentage points. So it's still high, especially when you compare that to our higher socioeconomic groups, 1 to 2, which is 22.8 in the latest year of data. It's probably around 21 overall, 2021 overall, if we aggregated all of the information together. But I'm going to come back to that group in a minute because it's important. A couple of other things that I'd like to just observe on here. Gender. Look at the men and women towers. Okay, and this pattern of, you know, the inequality nationally is women are more likely to be inactive than men nationally. There's about 3 percentage points difference between the two groups. Okay, it fluctuates in the East Riding. Sometimes men are more likely to be inactive in the years of data. Sometimes women are more likely to be inactive in the years of data. What that suggests to me is they're both probably quite similar, and there's not that much inequality at play, and we need to be thinking about both genders because they're flicking around quite a bit. And I will pick at that a little bit more shortly. Just remember where we started with the age population on this. We've had to remove the 16 to 34s because the sample was really, really quite small. But just be conscious of that age group now. 55 to 74-year-olds, we're up at 31, you know, 3 in 10 of that age group that are inactive. Our 75 pluses is up at 45, but comparatively to England, it's quite good. And you'll see when we compare that group to nearest neighbours in a few slides' time that it compares quite well, whereas some of these other ones don't. I want to come back to higher socioeconomic status, NSEC 1 to 2. That's high. Okay, look at the way the black dot is compared to the red tower on that far right. So this is our banker group. We know that this roughly makes up, this part of our community is roughly about a third, you know, 3 in 10 to a third, and very more usually experiencing very low levels of inactivity. Nationally, I think it's around 16, 17 percentage points. It has increased in the pandemic, only a little bit though, but locally we're quite a bit higher than that. And what's you know, the next slide just helps us understand that a little bit more, because what you see, so this is inactive at the bottom, active at the top for higher socioeconomic status over the 5 years of data that we've got. And you can just see how that inactive proportion in this group is increasing. And that's not the case across all groups. As I mentioned at the beginning, relatively stable most groups, but this group are fluctuating around a bit, which would suggest they're relatively stable. But this group seems to be on a pattern of not being where we'd like it to be. And you definitely see that in the active towers. Look at how gradually these are coming down. That is a challenge. I know that this part of our community is probably not the place where that will attract a lot of national investment, but we do need to be thinking about what is going on here. What do we know locally that might help us understand this group, especially where it might overlap with the older part of our community, that part of our community that are living with long-term conditions and or a limiting illness. Where we start to think about that secondary demographic, there's some need for attention here. And rurality, and you know, some of you will be sat there thinking about it. Rurality is probably a play in some of this, and I've got a bit on that a little bit later, so we'll come back to that. But it's unusual for me to be picking a slide out for an SSEC 1 to 2 like this, but we need to be aware of it. We need to be thinking about it. Getting into places, I use the term places a bit loosely. We can cut, or we can use Sport England's data where they've cut it. We can use some of this information, Sport England model it down to middle super output areas. What on earth does that mean? Well, census data is collected from every household in the country. That data is grouped into small areas called output areas. Okay, and then it's built up into lower super output areas, and then it's built up into middle super output areas. A middle super output area is between 5 and 15,000 people. Okay, and Sport England model this data down to that area so that we can get below the local authority level and think about where there might be differences in our levels of activity or inactivity in different parts of our place. Okay, so I've got some data on that. We've been able to cut it by deprivation. I've got a bit of data on that, which is, you know, quite an interesting pattern. We've been able to cut it by urban and rural. We've got a bit of a sample challenge with that again, but they're all reasonable. I think they're all publishable as well in terms of our, you know, what we, you know, the kind of size of the sample that we've agreed with Sport England that we're allowed to publish in terms of sharing it. And then I'm going to share with you some coastal analysis that we are really trying hard to work out with David and Sarah and others in terms of how do we define the coast? David Gent, by the way, if you don't know David Gent, he's on the call somewhere. He's now a worldwide expert in coastal definitions. So if you're ever looking for a coastal definition, David knows them all. So let me get into the data a little bit. Let's just start with these middle super output areas. Frustratingly, Sport England haven't published these for 2 years because they're reprocuring the organisation that does it. And so this is a couple of years old. We need to be conscious of that because it will change and it will shift. And what you've got here is that kind of patchwork quilt kind of method, of heat map method of just showing where higher levels of inactivity. The areas that we're interested in are the kind of white and the orange and the red areas. And it just starts to give you those middle super output areas, each of those different patchwork, you know, that's a middle super output area. And it starts to suggest to us which parts of our place are more likely to be inactive. Okay, those red areas are getting up to 4 in 10, you know, and remember that's across the whole of the population. Certain groups within those communities, those red areas will overlay quite significantly with deprivation. You'll see that on a slide in a minute. And it would also, especially where older age meets deprivation, those areas are more likely to be red. Okay, so you get this sense of where parts of our community that are more likely to be experiencing inactive. But I'm going to get underneath that a little bit in a slide or two, in the next couple of slides. Firstly, let's just remind ourselves, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the one on the left, which is IMD, the indices of multiple deprivation. That the darker the brown, the more deprived the community. So the really dark brown areas would be in the most deprived parts of the country, and then the really dark green areas are the opposite, and you've got all of the shift in between. Okay. I'm going to come back to the data for that in a second or two. I also just wanted to put this up as well. Urban-rural classification. You might not be aware of this, but the Office of National Statistics classify all of our communities into either, well, they've got loads of different definitions along a spectrum. We've stripped it down to 3. Okay, the green areas are rural. The purple and the grey areas are classed by urban based on ONS's definition. Okay, we can split the data by that, and I will come back to that shortly. Let's just have a quick look at deprivation. So what we've taken, because the sample isn't big enough, we can split it into 4 groups. Least deprived quartile of areas on one end, we've got inactivity up at 24 percentage points. It's quite a bit higher than national, interestingly. And then at the other end, we've got the most deprived quartile of communities, where it's considerably higher than national. Okay, and we're up at 40% of inactivity in there. And actually look at the second most deprived quartile as well. Again, significantly higher than what we see nationally. But note that least deprived bit as well, because I think it's important, and it comes back to the point that I've already mentioned around socioeconomics, higher socioeconomic groups of our population, maybe inactivity levels being higher there than we would expect. What we do know is that regardless of socioeconomic status, if you live in a deprived community, you are more likely to experience being inactive regardless of socioeconomic status. It increases inactivity levels by living in part of those communities, and that will be down to the factors that are at play in IMD, also environmental opportunities, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite important information. The samples are all right. I'd like the most deprived sample to be a bit bigger than it is. We've had to combine all 5 years of data to be able to do this, but they're all right. And you can see, regardless of the sample, those confidence intervals are still, for the second most deprived and the most, are still well above that black line, which is what we need, and well above England as well. So we know that the situation locally is a bit more challenging when it comes to our more deprived communities. Just moving on now to urban and rural. We've got those demographic groups again across the bottom, and we've got the proportion of inactive people for those different, different demographic groups, but this time split by urban and rural. Okay, and you can see the general pattern is the East Riding's more urban areas are more likely to experience inactivity. People living in those areas are more likely to experience inactivity. It's not the case across the board, though, and we need to be conscious of that. And there are some differences that are quite important. But look also at some of the different, for example, it's one way for females, it's the other way for males. So we just need to be thinking about some of this. Look at the NSSEC; they're both quite tall, but there is a difference. And so we just need to be thinking about the kind of communities, the makeup of those communities, the access to paths, footpaths, cycle paths, spaces to move, opportunities, etc., etc., because they are at play. We've put the confidence intervals. I think all these are actually publishable. I'll check them. So we're okay, but the confidence intervals, just be conscious of them. Some of them, especially with the kind of 75 pluses, the limited illness, they're getting a bit wider. That NSSEC 6 to 8 is getting a bit wider as well. But it's helpful, isn't it? I was quite intrigued by some of the patterns in this, in terms of the differences that we see in our rural and urban communities, and how and how that's grouped. It might be worth you having a look back at the previous slide and working out which communities are and which towns fall into urban classification, etc., etc. I'm going to move on to the coastal data now. Now, sadly, I can only show you where we're at with the Humber level, because we've come up with a problem that we need to clarify with Sport England. But on to David's well thought through definition. So David and I and Sarah have been looking at, how on earth do you define coastal? Okay, we've looked at the Chief Medical Officer's report that was published recently around health inequalities. Not the Chief Medical Officer's, yes, Chief Medical Officer's report, where they looked at health inequalities in coastal communities. We took that definition and basically that identified the likes of Grimsby, Hull, Bridlington, and a couple of other places along the coast. And we looked at it and thought, well, that's only part of the coast. That's not all of our coastal community. So we didn't like that. Intuitively, it didn't sit well with us. David then found a couple of other definitions, a World Health Organization one, which I think was any community within 70 miles of the coast or 70 kilometers of the coast. Well, that would put the whole of the UK in it. So that doesn't work for us. So we'll ignore that one. We then found, or David found one for Scotland, where it talked about 5 kilometers from the coast, which we felt right, feels a little bit better that we can think about it in that way. So what we've done here is we've mapped 5 kilometers from the high tide line. Okay, that's the dotted blue line. We've stopped at the Humber Bridge. Okay, there is a debate as to whether we shouldn't, you know, but if we carry on all the way up to York, or you know, wherever it ends, we probably then need to bring the north and south tributaries into it. That brings pretty much the whole of the Humber and the whole of the East Riding into being 5 kilometers from the coast. We didn't think that fit very well, so we've kind of gone with this for now as our starter for 10. Okay, so this is that dotted blue dot line identifying what we kind of see as coastal community. And then we've identified lower super output areas. They're between 1,000 and 5,000 people that either completely fall into that space, or over 50% of the lower super output area falls into that boundary. So you'll see the odd one where there's a bit where there's a gap, like down near Immingham, where there's a bit of a gap because 50% of the LSOA is not inside the boundary. So we've discarded it at the moment. We're continuing to play around with this. What we've done this for is because if we can identify these low super output areas, like using this method, we can look at the data from the responses that have directly come from those lower super output areas. So we can look at that as some kind of coastal, not coastal kind of comparator. Now, the reason why I can only share Humber with you at the moment is because when my colleague Martin, who is a bigger nerd than me, when he's looked at the data for this, he's noticed something. Firstly, when we looked at the latest year of data that we've got this for, only half of the sample we can allocate to a lower super output area. When Martin's gone to look at this for previous, because I'm going to show you what comes out of that in a second, but when he's gone to look at the previous years of data, the whole of the sample has got a lower super output area code for it. So we want to know what's going on there from Sport England before we do any further work. So we've got a question in. Martin's liaising with Sport England's research team for us to try and understand that before we start to aggregate this data and try and think about how we use it. All being well, we'll be able to try and create a sample that would be able to identify the coastal area of the East Riding specifically. But that is an all being well statement at the moment. It might not work depending on the conversation with Sport England. What does it look like in terms of levels of inactivity comparative, you know, in the coastal area compared to the not coastal area in the Humber? Well, it looks like that in 1 year of data. There's quite a big difference. Now, to a degree, we'd expect that because of the Humber level, it's bringing in the likes of most of Grimsby, most of Hull. So we've got to just be conscious of that. And we know they're urban areas that are more likely to experience quite high levels of deprivation and have a larger communities from lower that are in lower socioeconomic groups. So there's a lot of factors playing out there. Hopefully we'll be able to tease this out and look at it for the East Riding. We had a quick look at it for the East Riding, but the sample in 1 year is quite small, and that gap is similar in the East Riding, but the sample is too small for us to be able to just play that out right now. So we'll have this conversation with Sporting and we'll see if we can get it to stack up, and if we can get it to stack up, we'll obviously share the results of it with you. But it's intriguing, and it helps follow this line of inquiry around the experiences that our coastal communities have when it, you know, not just comes to being active, but health inequalities, etc., etc. One of my favorite slides coming up now, but sadly Martin stopped drawing it as a pie, which is really disappointing because I do like a good pie, but it's not a pie. But what he's done is really quite intriguing. He's added up all the minutes. Where do people get their minutes from? Okay, and then he's broken it down into different groups, and he's done that for this year of data, the first year of the pandemic, and that includes those first 8 months of the pandemic, and last year of data, no pandemic. Okay, and you're going to see some intriguing shifts, some of which you'll expect. one of which I didn't. So so let's just have a quick look at that. So what you've got is the categories down the left hand side, whether we've got our minutes from walking for leisure, whether we've got our minutes from walking for travel, gardening, fitness activities, traditional sport. What does that mean? Pretty much everything else. Okay, your volleyball, your cricket, your tennis, your football, your climbing, etc., etc., etc. All of that, all of those minutes are in traditional sport. Fitness activities like your Joe Wicks, your gyms, your classes, etc., all in fitness activities. Okay, the 1920 tower is the pale blue, the 1819 tower is the dark blue. Okay, now what we would have expected on there is that shift in traditional sport. Of course we would. Lockdown, closed. People couldn't go and get their minutes from the places that they would, the opportunities that they would get their minutes from. So we're going to see a shift in those minutes. Okay, what bucks the national trend on this slide though is walking for leisure, because walking for leisure nationally and in every other area that we've done this analysis for has actually gone up during this latest year of data, not gone down, which is fascinating. Okay, so what has gone on? I don't know. How that is related to urban rural areas, I don't know. I can't tell you, but there is an interesting pattern there. Gardening has also gone up in the during this pandemic year. That's gone up nationally, and in some areas it's gone up really quite strikingly. It's only gone up a little bit in terms of the East Riding, which again is intriguing. And so we've got some patterns on here. What I would observe as well at this point is if you just imagine this drawn as a pie chart, because it's easier to get that picture in your head. So you've got these 6 pieces of cheese that make up this pie chart, and the total size of the pie obviously can change shape, can't it? The more minutes, the more people that are doing more minutes, the bigger the pie gets, and we cut it into 6 pieces and so on and so forth. Okay, what's happened in East Riding that I don't well, it hasn't happened in other areas that we've done this analysis. That's what I can so far can say, and I don't think it's happened nationally either. Is the pie has got smaller. So what does that mean? Well, we've got this pattern that people see, our inactivity levels haven't changed that much. So but our fairly active has changed. So people seem to be doing fewer minutes. And a greater proportion of our people are doing fewer minutes. Some of those are managing to get over the 150 line, but maybe not as far over it as they used to. What we often have seen in other areas, and I think this is the case off the top of my head, I think it's the case for the Humber, is that the pie has got bigger, but being done by fewer people. So the active have got even more active, higher socioeconomic groups, people that are now working from home, got more or were working from home and had more time to fit their activity in around being either furloughed or working from home, or a very big change in working pattern. But that doesn't seem to be as much at play in the East Riding. This is a really big assumption. I think it's age related, and I think it's to do with the age of the population. But I can't tease that out straight away, if at all. But Martin might be able to. But there is an interesting pattern going on here that seems to not fit with what we've seen in other places, which is quite intriguing. And that drop in minutes is about, the average has gone down about 150 minutes. Now, take that with a pinch of salt, because there's lots of challenges with playing with the minutes data that I won't get into now because it's incredibly technical and boring. But that's a big drop. Okay, it's a really big drop, and we haven't seen that in many other places that we've done this. In fact, we've seen it go the other way. So there's an interesting little pattern emerging there. Okay, I'm pretty much near enough done. Summary: another set of remember those the table where we've put a whole population into the list of all local authorities. There's going to be a slide next with all of the different demographic groups on where it's done. It's drawn a slightly different way, but hopefully you'll be able to follow it. So we're going obviously horizontal now. It's the same method though. All the grey lines represent all the local authorities. The red line is where East Riding sits in that list. Okay, look at where it is for the whole population in the top left-hand corner. It's just a really visual way to look at which groups aren't maybe where they should be. Look at the whole population, just below mid-table. Now look at the groups that are actually down at the wrong end or to the right of that list. NSSEC 1 to 2, quite low down the list. NSSEC 6 to 8, quite low down the list. Men, maybe not where they should be, but remember what I said, that is fluctuating a lot, that male and female data. So be cautious of that. No limiting illness, actually slightly worse than limiting illness when it comes to this kind of comparison. Okay, 16 to 34 is positive. Okay, middle age, getting a little bit older, not as positive, a bit further down the list than we'd expect them to, but the over 75 is doing pretty well. You know, so we've got some interesting patterns there. Remember where I started though, that 45 to 54-year-old age group is going through into our 55 and over, where we've already got a fairly high level of inactivity, 30% and above, and we've potentially got a bigger proportion within our population over the next 10 to 20 years. So we've got to be thinking about how those demographics are changing, potentially changing this data. Just to bring that into real numbers, because it's easier, isn't it, to when we start to think of real numbers. You know, that male, female, and the no limiting illness bit, I park that to some extent. I think the more interest becomes in those middle groups, low socioeconomic group, 32,000 people across the East Riding that are inactive, 55 to 74, 30,000, limiting illness, 28,000. We know that those three groups will overlap quite a bit, especially when you start to think about the over 60s, the over 55s, and limiting illnesses and conditions. That's the age group that the conditions tend to start for most of the most conditions. So these groups absolutely overlay with each other. In total, they add up to around 80,000, as I mentioned earlier. And that NSSEC 2, it's down at 18,000. But at the moment, it's potentially a growing challenge. It's a bit of a thing that we need to be conscious of. But what I'm more intrigued with there is not the inactivity change. I'm actually more intrigued with this falling out of active and what we might understand about that locally and how that is growing this fairly active group. And then you have got my final thoughts, just kind of summarizing, hopefully, everything that I've gone over there. We need to be considerate of that population and the migration and the way that that's changing over the next 20 years. We've got a higher proportion of inactive people. To a degree, we might expect that because we've got a slightly older population with more limiting illness and conditions, but we don't compare that great to our nearest neighbours when we start to look at some of that data, which we need to be conscious of. The pandemic maybe hasn't hit as hard in terms of inactivity in the East Riding as it has in other areas, which is a good thing. And the early signs from that May to May is that's maybe continuing. We need to keep an eye on it. However, we do have some inequalities. You know, we've still got a significant inequality between those in higher and lower socioeconomic groups, but both groups aren't where we'd want them to be. And we've got this inequality when it comes to those with a limiting illness and those without. And that has been thus the case for far too long. And so what is it that we need to be starting to think about how those parts of our community see the opportunity, experience the ability to move? It poses some quite significant challenges for us, and you have got this really complicated territory, if I may say so, coastal, rural, and then pockets of urban. And we need to be thinking quite differently about the experiences that our population have in those different places, because it's really quite dynamic in some senses. That's me for now. Not a single question. So that's either everybody asleep or just blown away or lost, which could be any of the three.